Okay, good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much to all of you for coming. I know it's not a very good weather, so I hope that hasn't been risky, and I do hope you enjoy the talk between Lorenzo and Álvaro. He's really a very smart author, Lorenzo, so I'm sure it will be pretty interesting. I just wanted to thank the Instituto Cervantes for hosting the act. It's really our first event in New York, and it's a real pleasure and luck for us to be here in their premises. I wanted to thank Álvaro Fernández as well for taking on the participation in the act and talking with Lorenzo on his book. And just very briefly, for those of you who are not aware of what we do, ISPA Books is a very recently born new independent publishing house specialized on publishing contemporary Spanish literature in English language translation. Lorenzo's book has been one of the first one we've published. We have other 4 up to date. There will be another one coming before the end of the year, and from there on, basically 1 per month. And anyway, I hope you follow what we do and have the chance to enjoy really good Spanish literature in your language. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Good night, everybody, and thank you for coming at such a night, and thank you, Lorenzo, for coming from so far. For me as a critic, it's great to talk about the book I really like. In general, I don't have this chance. Sometimes I have to read books I don't like and talk about them, not in front of the authors. This is probably the pleasure I have of writing about the book without the author in front of me. But now I really like this book, so could you read us a little bit? Yes, so start with that.
Well, good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's such an awful day. Well, I am going to read a short chapter of this book. It's the chapter where the main character remembers his childhood, among other things. I think it's a good approach to the personality of this character, and also to the style of the book. Going to the swimming pool always reminds me of my childhood. And that doesn't mean that going to the swimming pool makes me happy. In spite of what thousands of simpletons maintain, perhaps in their eagerness to recoup the physical and psychological effort that having children entails, children live in an uncivilized and morally inferior world. Abuse, violence, and gratuitous cruelty reign amongst them. One of the few things I appreciate about being an adult is that I don't have to be constantly afraid that people who are taller than me might decide to send me sprawling to the ground and twist my arm until I burst into tears. It may happen on very rare occasions, but in the school playground, it's very rare that it doesn't happen. In school playgrounds, it's always the biggest brute who rules the roost, and the rest, among whom there may be highly spiritual children or precocious talents, how to resign themselves to doing his course, bidding, or become martyrs, or perhaps becoming martyrs in spite of having done his bidding, depending on how bad a mood the relevant beast is in. In childhood, the crudest and most brutal characteristics of humanity prevail. When I was a child, surrounded by other children, I used to hate the human race and regretted having landed among members of such a dangerous and primitive species. I don't exactly consider myself a philanthropist nowadays, but the adult riffraff who form the backdrop of my daily life sometimes offer the counterpoint of exhibiting a certain intellectual merit. I may be mistaken, but I prefer Lorenzo de' Medici to a bully with his shirt tails hanging out, his shoelaces undone, and a dirty face, beating his chest, surrounded by a group of intimidated little kids. I had a powerful opportunity to experience the fact that childhood is a state at odds with intelligence, sensitivity, and all the other characteristics that differentiate man from other primates, thanks to the one and only time when I was about to believe the opposite. When I was 7 or 8 years old, I managed to get the dumbest boy in school, an individual capable of fighting 8 other boys at once and beating them all, to blindly obey any orders I gave him. For a while, I lived under the illusion of submitting brute force to the plans of a superior mind. In this way, my circle of friends, who did not partake in the sterile pastimes that occupied most children, but instead preferred the practice of all sorts of industrious activities, like making explosives, constructing miniature cities, and organizing fantastic storytelling competitions, were able to dedicate themselves to them without wasting time fighting with other boys. When anyone tried to bother us, I would set Lizardo, that was my invincible slave's name, loose on them, and he could deal with the troublemakers comprehensively, breaking noses, fracturing skulls, and knocking out teeth like a veritable war machine. Such was my control over him that after each scuffle, Lizardo would sing a little ditty of my invention that combined his name and surnames with the word Willie. The result was grotesque, and Lizardo himself was the first to raucously applaud it. Anyway, one day, when Lizardo seemed a bit surly, I took the unfortunate step of submitting my power over him to a test from which it didn't come out well, and which convinced me to watch out for tall guys for the rest of my childhood. Nobody had attacked us, and so there was no reason for Lizardo to sing his little song. But to impress the others, I ordered him to sing. Lizardo seemed reluctant. I began to sing it to encourage him. The giant looked at me, and I realized, too late, that something was stirring, perhaps for the first time, inside his thick skull. Without a word, he came over to me, lifted me up in the air, and gave me a tremendous beating, right there, in front of everyone. I can still feel the blows, and my reputation, based for the most part on my influence over Lizardo, was completely destroyed. Ever since, I've never believed that a child will respect any authority except that of whoever can hit harder than he can. Everything else is a waste of time. Another thing that puts me off swimming pools is that there, the suntanned airheads who do somersaults off the diving board are the top of the food chain. I've never been able to get a suntan, and I've always been loath to accept that the best thing to do with your school is risk smashing it to bits against the end of the board or the side of the pool. As a consequence, swimming pools have never been a place I've had much success in. To tell you the truth, my life at swimming pools has been for the most part a life of silence and solitude. One of the few activities that helped me while away the time at swimming pools, other than swimming and going on reconnaissance walks, was reading. Even though it takes all sorts, I prefer to do those 3 things best silently and by myself. The swimming pool was the place where hot chicks were hotter than anywhere else. The problem was that they were always fawning over the kings of the diving board, and didn't even see the sallow complexioned peasants like me. This developed my imagination and gave me a complex soul, for which, as I believe I've written in these very pages, I am not ungrateful. But the price of all this was a certain sadness I didn't much enjoy at the time. When I got tired of my book, which happened frequently, since a pool is a pretty uncomfortable place to read a book, and I got tired of swimming, which was even easier, since swimming physically tires you out, and I got tired of walking around, inebriated by all the sun-tanned flesh on display that sooner or later would fall under the sporty caresses of the springboard kings, I had no place left to hide. At that point, I would go and sit at the edge of the pool, and twilight would fall. And twilight was, in a way, a lukewarm type of humiliation. With all this in mind, and for other reasons that I am neither willing nor able of summarizing, I experienced a mixture of curiosity and unease on thinking about the possibility of going to a swimming pool with Rosanna that Saturday. My curiosity was piqued by the idea of not being alone at the swimming pool, but in the company of Rosanna. My childhood aside, from time to time, I've been to a swimming pool with someone, but never with somebody like her, whom, although she wasn't as stand as a sister Sonsoles, I could identify with the girls who used to ignore me in my younger years. The unease sprang from the prospect of returning to that world I had always found so hostile, full of diving boards and guys whose complexions were invariably less pale than mine. Sure, you can meditate to your heart's content to try to come to terms with what makes you different, even to turn it into a source of pride. After all, who doesn't try to overcome their shortcomings by turning them into a virtue? That's all fine and dandy, but sometimes, when you're least expecting it, it slowly dawns on you that one of the biggest wimps in history, that ungainly Czech called Franz Kafka, told the tale of a poor bloke who turns into a cockroach one morning and is rejected by his family, who go off on a day trip when the cockroach finally dies. As is well known, two of the things we featherless bipeds most desire is not to be rejected by anybody, and that nobody should go off on a day trip after we die.
Green light.
I have the red light. Can you hear me?
Oui.
No. You take the curious. But you could hear me, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's better. Yeah, okay. So, thank you, Lorenzo. So, one question I had about that. In general, the authors has the chance of forgetting their books because they could just publish a book and start writing another one and say, okay, this book is in the past, but this book is like coming back into your life with the movie, with the translations. How have you been feeling with these rewritings of the book? You're supposed to be rereading the book. You've been reading the book again in different languages, watching the movie. How have you been feeling with all these other versions of the book along the years? It's like 15 years after you wrote it.
Yes, it's a curious thing because the book has been reprint every year since its year of appearance, and from time to time, as you say, it's rewritten or retold by someone, either on a book or a film, in one opportunity. So what I feel about that is that this story has a strange ability to keep itself alive. And there's another thing. The main character of the novel is an investment banker. An investment banker in the Spain of the 90s was someone whose work hardly anyone knew a single thing about. But now, in the Spain of the beginning of the 21st century, the second decade of the 21st century, everyone knows what an investment banker is because of Lehman Brothers and all these kind of things. There's another point, for example. There's a chapter talking about, it's a funny thing to talk about in a novel, but the main character is a kind of a strange guy with strange ideas and strange thoughts. In one chapter, he makes some reflections about the labor system in Spain, the labor law in Spain, and the different kind of workers you can find according to the Spanish law with different rights and different positions. I wrote that taking into account or looking at the labor law existing there. The labor law existing now in Spain has not improved but worsened the position of all these workers, and this chapter is being used, for example, in some law schools to explain to the students how the Spanish labor law is structured regarding to the rights of workers. So I don't know, this book has got something that was beyond my intention, beyond my power, and beyond my forecast, because for example, I wrote this book for adult people. I mean, it's a book, it's a story about loss. You can't have the experience of real loss if you're not at least a little adult. And this book has also been read, and that's one of the reasons why it's been reprinted every year. It has been read in high schools in Spain, to my astonishment initially.
Yeah, I cannot imagine how, when I can yell, right? It's great, thank you for that. I cannot imagine how I can teach the book and, yeah. Oh, okay.
I cannot imagine how to teach a book here in the United States because some references are so delicate. I don't know what's more disturbing, what could be more disturbing for my students, not in high school, at the university. If the reference to the love of the main character to a 15 years old girl, or not but the main character reflections about job or working. This idea that working is one of the worst things that could happen to you, and the worst of the worst is thinking about what work means. So this goes against all the American values, or all the values that we are supposed to convey at the university. So the book is so hard to teach in a way. I have to explain many things if I want to explain it. I remember the time I wanted to explain one of the Juan Goytisolo books, Paisajes Después de la Batalla, Landscape After the Battle, that the point of view of the character, in a way, has something to do with that. I mean, this idea of having a very negative and very cynical point of view about the society, a society that is corrupted, deeply corrupted. So, but you recognize yourself, you're writing in the English version, when you're reading, this is your book too?
Well, I have something to say about these two questions you raised. As regards the attraction of the main character towards a 15-year-old girl, I have to say, you have to take into account, and I had to repeat again and again in Spain, this is not Lolita, first of all, because Lolita was younger, and secondly, because here you can't find the second part of Lolita. You can't find this descent into hell, because the attraction never goes beyond a platonic one, which is very important to tell. In my view, this is not Lolita. In my view, this is Dante's Beatrice, which is very different, very, very different. As regards the other point, you have to take into account that he's talking about a job he detests. I mean, he's not working about work or a job abstractly. He's talking about the experience that is shared by many people, unfortunately, of having a work you are not interested in at all, or that you hate. And it is worse when you have something you like, something you could do, something you would love doing, but you are not paid for that. You are paid for the other awful thing That's a very and a slight but important difference to the interpretation of rejecting work, because I don't share. I know he's not me. I mean, he's a fiction character, and I share with him some experiences. Some other I don't. Some other it's my opposite. As a matter of fact, I've been doing for 30 years the thing I love best in the world. So that's not my experience at all. But something I think he could also say, and that I think is that work, doing what you love, is really the only salvation we have as human beings. If you are not doing things we enjoy, if we are not doing things we love, then we are not offering those things to the others. I don't understand what are we doing here. So just commenting these two issues. As regards the English version, well, I have had the opportunity of looking at the French, Russian, and Czech versions of this book. I only understood the French one. As regards the Czech and the Russian, they remain a mystery to me. So I've been told the two translators were very good. In fact, the Russian translator has been the translator for many 20th century classics in Spanish. The Czech translator is also very good, as I was told by a Czech reader who loved the book. Well, the English version, I was able to read it and to understand it. And I think they did such a great job, such a difficult job, because sentences in Spanish are very different from English sentences. I like long sentences. I like long sentences because Spanish gives you the opportunity of building complex structures, and I like to do so because I think that's a way of saying more things. That's it. You can do it by short sentences, but you lose the music in Spanish. But English it's a difficult language to put these long sentences, and I think they did a great job at that. And they did a great job at finding equivalent to many words that were not easy to translate. The first good job they did, Nick Keister and Isabel Koffler, who have translated the book, was the title. The title in the Spanish original is La Flaqueza del Bolchevique. When the movie was shot, the movie had American producers. In fact, they had to translate the title into English, and they opted by something really very simple: the weakness of the Bolshevik, which is not at all what flaqueza means. This is not a physical weakness, but something very, very different. And I had some conversations about the title, even with translators in Spain, and I have an English friend who happens to be was the correspondent of the BBC in Madrid, and he provided me with let's say smart translation, which was the flaw in the Bolshevik. But that's not the idea either, or that's not comes to me English. And this is the faint-hearted Bolshevik. When I heard it, I thought this is English, first of all, and secondly is what I wanted exactly to say.
Great. Something that was strange. I read the book in Spanish first. When I read it, it reminds me some other books from. Of course, it has to do with my experiences and with the genre, but it reminds me the Spanish versions of Jim Thompson or Raymond Chandler, for the point of view, basically. But I used to read these authors in Spanish, the translation of Bruguera, the publisher. Spanish publisher, so for me it was American literature translated to Spanish, and it was a point of view of this very hard point of view that for me when I was a teenager was so interesting, so good. It was in a way reenacted when I read your style, when I read the Bolshevik, when I read his point of view, his approaches to the Spanish society, and for me it was so refreshing because this book is about a time after the fall of the falling of the Berlin Wall, a time without politics, suppose, after the end of history, and you chosen a very interesting point of view, a point of view of someone. I mean, to write a hard-boiled story, the point of view of someone that is not completing the margins of the society, as most of the characters in the typical hard-boiled novels. You've chosen someone that is in a very prestigious point of the society to deconstruct everything. When I read the book, I thought, well, this book is very hard to be written in Spain now, because in this moment Spain was kind of like a very optimistic point of view about their own society, and you were making a very hard critic about the society. So now with the crisis, you think that the book could be written in I don't know, like a book that is really talking about the very important point of view of the Spanish society, basically recovering something that is very important, but in the 90s was not that clear.
Well, perhaps as regards the American influence, of course, I also read those authors in the same editions, and that's something I liked. I liked in their books, which perhaps was told by Raymond Chandler when he defined his detective as a man in search of a hidden truth, a man who is searching a hidden truth, who dares say it, and that's always my, I would say, even my motto with my characters. I like my characters to look for the truth and to tell the truth also, even if it hurts, as it usually does. There's a classical Spanish verse from Francisco de Quevedo, which says, pues amarga la verdad, quiero echarla de la boca. Since the truth is a bitter one, I want to throw it away from my mouth. So, and that is also in connection with your question. I thought when I was living in that society, that proud, self-satisfying Spanish society of the 90s, I thought that many things didn't work well. Many things were not reasonable, were not fair, and were not things that could go well in the nearest future. I've never been a prophet, but it was quite obvious that Spain had become very quickly, let's say, a rich country. The education was not in accordance. The education of people was not in accordance with the wealth, with a very quick enrichment of the society, economic enrichment, I mean. And I thought that these guys, like the guy in the novel, he's an investment banker, which means I used to work for 10 years in a big company, in the energy sector, and I dealt almost every day with people like this, people who were intelligent, people who were even sensitive, people who were not, as you would say, people who had only money in mind. Some of them had studied philosophy, history, but they have been recruited by these banks because they were intelligent, in order to make things look what things were not. Because that's the secret. That's the secret with the subprime, for example. They make you feel that something which is trash financially is like gold. And this is the job of these people. And many people was working on that in Spain at that time. and that could not lead to a successful outcome. That was pretty obvious.
In general, when we are thinking about historical memory or the readings of historical memory, we are all the time thinking, I mean, inside the criticism in Spanish literature, Hispanic criticism, even South American criticism, we are like focusing in some specific times. When we are talking about historical memory in Spain, in general we mean civil war, probably something about dictatorship. But I think that probably in 20 years or so, when we need to find some answers about what happened in Spain, how this big crisis appeared, and how the society changed that much from the transition to the beginning of 21st century. Probably your novel could be considered one of the novels that has something to say about historical memory, because it's one of these novels where you could perceive a very critical image of the Spanish society, not only just about the way it works on the company, the guy that is working in the company. You have the childhood, you have the way he looks at the girl, at the pija girl, this high class girl that is so beautiful. Is the image of his, in a way, he's feeling he's questioning everything he has on his background, because this beauty is too much for him, even when she belongs to the other side, right? But I guess your novel could be read in this way, like a novel that is talking about historical memory. Sometimes we think when we are analyzing the hard-boiled genre that is a new realism that is probably one of the most acid and realistic way of describing a society. I don't know if you're feeling like you are doing that, but if we want to think how Galdós would be writing in the 20th century, you could probably talk about Chirves, Rafael Chirves, but you could see that some of the Andreu Martín or Vázquez Montalbán or Marcelo, or even your novel, are closer to these aesthetics of trying to portray a society in a very hard way or very critic way, right? Have you thought about yourself, about your literature, like in this realistic genre, or is something you haven't done that?
I don't know, and I can't control how the books will be read in the future. That's something to readers to decide. But I have the intention of portraying Spanish contemporary society, of course. And this is not my only project. Perhaps my biggest project for doing so is my crime fiction series, which is a fiction of seven books, 6 novels, and a book of short stories, and until now, whose main characters are 2 investigators of the Spanish Guardia Civil, which is one of the police corpses now operating in Spain. And they are dealing with murders and with murderers, but there's a variety of stories. They deal with the organized crime, but they also deal with amateur murders, which are, to me, the most interesting ones. And I try to portray Spanish society, and I try to look at I like to look at the hidden flaws in the Spanish societies, because I think you talked about historical memory, and as you say, when you say that, you always look at civil war, and civil war is a kind of black hole where everything gets into. But for example, another of my concerns of a writer are the years before the Civil War. The Civil War didn't come from nothing. The Civil War came from, for example, the Morocco War. the last big Spanish colonial war. Nobody, apart from Arturo Barea and Ramon Sender, had written about that. The Spanish novelists were looking at nothing when these things were happening. Tens of thousands of Spaniards were sent to this slaughtering of the African war, and the Spanish intellectuals were talking about Berlin and about things that were very interesting to them, because they were exempt from going to war, because the African war was a war where people who had a little money could avoid being sent. Only poor people were sent to Africa. And these people would be the anarchists, would be all these revolutionary forces that, in a way, impeded the success of the Second Republic in Spain, and who were one of the sides in the Civil War. You can't understand the Civil War if you don't know about the African story. And this story was a living story that the Spanish writers at the time didn't tell, which is, to me, even a scandal. We have, fortunately, Arturo Barea, Ramon Sender, some other two, that talk about that because they went there. They were sent to the war. Arturo Barea because he was poor, and Ramon Sender because he had the opportunity to avoid the war. He was a very special guy and decided to go. And those are the only two testimonies we have of that war, which was so important to Spain, which changed the story of Spain. I have written 2 novels about that war because I thought it's an episode that we have to tell again and again in order to understand something, and in order to avoid many misinterpretations we do about the Spanish Civil War, which perhaps is the most important chapter in 20th century Spanish history.
Yeah, but in a way, the importance of the Civil War is like a black hole, what you're saying, and probably is blocking the access to other parts of history. And probably one of the problems is this new ideology of the neoliberal tendencies that came up with so strength after the falling of Berlin Wall. But in general, after that, Spain was having probably the same context in the same international context that the other literature that were having these two tendencies. One tendency that was celebrating this cosmopolitanism or globalization and the apparently lack of political readings, and another tendency that is trying to recover the political readings. When I was reading the novel, I felt it was a novel that probably any party in Spain would like. About the description, probably the description of the society you do there was not couldn't be signed for any party. It was more like an anarchist point of view, from the point of view of the main character. But it's a very interesting novel because it's so political at the time. It's full of politics and it's full of history. To understand this novel, you need to know something about politics that are not discussed there. Even when the main character is discussing about the picture, he's discussing about the picture of the girls, and he's talking about history, knowing about history, but not specifically about history. He's like talking about history, but in a time that people don't used to talk about history anymore and about politics anymore. And he's choosing one side that is like at the side of politics. He's not taking like a position, a political position, a clear political position, but he's having like a human position and a contradictory one, in love with the enemy in a way, right?
Yeah, and there are 2 pictures in the book. One of the pictures with historical meaning. One of the pictures is the picture of the daughters of Tsar Nicholas the Second, the last Tsar, who were slaughtered by Bolsheviks in 1918, I think it was, and he makes a reflection on the episode of the Russian Revolution and the outcome of the experiment, because he's writing after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So that's the novel was written in '95, so just 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there's of course a reflection about what the revolution means, how the revolution is in the end is used by some people in order to achieve their personal goals. And there's another picture, which is a picture he's got in his home. It's the picture of a number of Spanish soldiers in the Moroccan War, one of whom is his grandfather. He's connected to that episode. He has the memory of that episode. If we talk about this picture and about this episode, we talk about patriotism, and we talk about the sense of being a real Spaniard. I mean, because all these wars are based on this kind of speakings. I mean, and you could say that the first picture represents one of the parties, one of the main parties, not only in Spain, but all over Europe. And the second picture reminds the main character of the other side, the side that usually organizes this kind of wars. And the problem with both, for the main character, the problem for any of us, I think, at this stage, is that we know that both lie. And lie in important things. And lie even all the time, which is absolutely unbearable. You need to run from that.
One of the shocking points there is that he says that the girls that comes with him at the department, they cannot recognize these guys as Spaniards.
Yes, yes. She asks him if they are Turks, because they are brown-skinned. With the sun in Africa is terrible, and people were dark-haired. Well, in Spain, most of us are dark-haired, but they were even darker. Their skin was darker. And she says that these guys are Turks, because what this girl represents is that Spanish youngest generations know nothing about their grandparents.
In a way, the novel is putting into question the big change that Spain has made during these last years. In the 90s, they kind of recognized their past, their own past, and this past looked like so far away from them. Right?
Looks like so far away, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close. I mean, my own grandfather was in the African war. I mean, that's too close. That's too close, because the effects of those things continue, and continue even in the Spanish transition. The Spanish transition was presented as a big success, with virtually no flaws at all. Everyone behaved in an ideal way. Everyone did a perfect job. That's not the case at all, because the problems to solve were too big, and some of them are even ignored by people who are supposed to solve them, because they don't know about history, they don't know about the background of many of the problems we have to face. In terms, for example, of assuming this historical memory, in terms of how organizing the country in order to keep all the parts of the country together, for example, because people don't know about the story of problems, so that they try to erase everything and to make a fresh start, which is impossible for a nation, for a country, for a society. You always have to take into account what has happened.
Well, when we are teaching literature, one of the problems we are having is that we cannot define literature very clearly. Our students ask us, what's literature? And we don't know. It's not clear what's literature is and what it is useful for. So, and if we could really teach literature, is one of the problems we are having, but probably one of the answers we have for about literature, one of the answers we could give them is that literature works to understand better some problems or to set some problems that are not seen clearly in society. And probably this book is working very well for that.
I think that that's, of course, a question I have asked to myself lots of times. What is this useful for? If it is. And I think literature can't solve problems. Literature can't answer questions. Perhaps literature doesn't raise questions, something that's from time to time you hear. Questions are raised. You don't need literature for raising the questions. I think literature is useful for spreading our consciousness about things, for being conscious of what's going on in hidden places, in the open spaces. You have press, you have television, you have the internet, you have Twitter, you have Facebook, you have all that. Now you have lots of sources, lots of places where you can see what's going on openly. And what's important to tell is what's going on the invisible level. And that's perhaps the mission of literature, looking for these invisible spaces and telling what you see with your look. You have more than that, but that's it.
Well, thank you. Probably the public wants to make some questions, so thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
I know how to project. I can project. I'd like to thank you. I read your book 15 years ago. I'll speak in English because I don't know how many speak Spanish here. I was in Madrid, Casa del Libro, and I asked someone to give me a title of a book to read, and he said to me, "What do you like to read?" I said, "I want literature. I want something that I can sink my teeth into. A book that will make me think. A character that will tell me, don't put me down. You're part of me." I commend you tremendously because you have created your protagonista. Did not let me stop. I cried at the end of your book. What happened to him at the end, I was like, no, it can't be. The psychological development of the character makes you feel him and try to understand his psychosis. It was very good. He reminded me of Unamuno in a book that he had written, Niebla, when the character comes and says, don't. Su libro fue una pasada. I recommended it to everyone. It had to come out. Está buenísimo, like we say in Valenciano. And I wish there were more writers like you, because I'm fortunate enough to be bilingual, and when I read, I want to read my language, because I live in America. And by reading your books, I've given it to everybody, and I'm glad now that it's in English, so that others can understand and enjoy it also. You're a wonderful writer. Thank you for writing, and keep on writing.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, my grandmother died 10 years ago, but now now she's been replaced in this for self-assurance. Thank you.
I want to say that I really enjoyed the portion of your book that you read, which is probably the best analysis of bullying that I think I've ever heard, even though it came from the mouth of a character. I remember that schoolyard. I was there. I won't say who I was.
We all were.
I remember that swimming pool of the guys with the big bronze muscles going off of the diving board. My question is whether you realize how apropos this is in America today, how al corriente, because there's now a tremendous public awareness that you hear on the news and everywhere else all the time about bullying, whether it's cyberbullying or bullying in elementary school or high school or college or even professional football teams. And also whether there is this kind of recognition now coming out in Europe and in Spain about the evil effects of bullying on people, and that it's not a normal part of human existence and doesn't have to be accepted. But other Europeans becoming aware of that also at this point.
Yes, I think so. I think so. Perhaps they weren't at the time the book was written. Perhaps at the time the book was written, the view of childhood was idealistic one, a soft view. But there have been a number of cases in Spain of young girls and young boys who have even committed suicide because of bullying. And now there's a big awareness in Spain, of course, about the subject. I even had the opportunity to participate in a collective book of short stories specifically addressed to describe bullying directly. I mean, they were 20 stories written by 20 writers, and the subject of all of them was bullying. What perhaps doesn't mean that the problem is being addressed properly in schools. I have 4 children, and I have seen, for example, I have 3 girls and a boy. My boy first hit his sister when he started going to school, and started insulting his sister when he started going to school. He was peaceful at home when he stayed there 2 years, and he learned violence in the school's playground. So, and I have always had the impression that the teacher's control on this is very, very slight.